Welcome back to Bethlem Museum of the Mind's virtual book club, which is devoted to reading Presumed Curable by Colin Gale, that's me, and Robert Howard. Today I'm sitting next to a display case in the museum in which is contained one of Bethlem's historic discharge registers, which contains details of who was discharged, how long they stayed, whether they were discharged recovered or uncured, and in a very small number of cases where they went next. If you've been watching these videos in sequence as they have been uploaded, you'll remember me saying a couple of weeks ago that normally we don't have access to information about where patients went after their discharge from Bethlem. And if you've read on from pages 76 through to 99 of Presumed Curable, as I hope you have since last week, you will have read the stories of 15 patients admitted to Bethlem in the 2-year period between February 1893 and March 1895. Most of these stories end abruptly upon their discharge from hospital, without any clue as to what has happened next. But as I also noted a couple of weeks ago, anyone with access to a family history website, such as Find My Past, to which historic Bethlem patient data has been uploaded, alongside census and birth, death and marriage records, anyone who has an interest in following the stories of these people through may be able to do so by conducting online searches. As long as the name of the person isn't something really common like it was 2 weeks ago, Helen Smith. Well, the person I want to focus on today is named Theodora Weston, who was admitted to the hospital aged 23 in July 1894, and whose story is told on pages 96 and 97 of Presumed Curable. Like Helen Smith and everyone else featured in the book, Theodora was photographed while in the hospital, but unlike Helen Smith, she was not wearing her own clothes at the time. Instead, she'd been placed in strong clothing that was made of canvas that did not restrain her in any way, but was tough and impossible to tear. This was not a hospital uniform. There was no hospital uniform as such, and as you will have noticed from the photographs in Presumed Curable, most people wore their own clothes. So the fact that Theodora Weston was in these strong clothes provides an insight into her state at the time the photograph was taken. Hers is, of course, the expressive and maudlin photograph that appears on the cover of Presumed Curable. Theodora's admission certificates speak of her as delusional, and she is described in her medical notes as demented. Comparatively little is said in these notes about how she was treated in the hospital. In this, Theodora's case is no different from that of most of the other people featured in the book we're reading. Patients' progress, or lack thereof, rather than a tally of medical intervention on the part of the hospital, was the focus of 19th century medical record keeping. And in any case, the hospital's interventions were more environmental and social than they were medical, as I've argued in the introduction to Presumed Curable. So, for example, the note on page 83 about a patient named Annie Cumberbatch, the fact that she played a piano duet with the hospital's physician superintendent in a concert program, well, that is indirect evidence of an environmental but nevertheless a therapeutic intervention having taken place. Aside from careful management of the hospital environment and the provision of a range of opportunities for recreation and occupation, the medical authorities at Bethlem were great believers in the benefits of hydrotherapy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In other words, prolonged warm bathing. Emily Crichton, whose case is described on pages 92 and 93 of Presumed Curable, was photographed during one of these bathing sessions. The cover placed over the bath, right up to and around her neck, as if it were a brace, was not there for the sake of modesty, but had a more sombre purpose. It was to prevent suicidal patients from attempting harm to themselves when the nurses' backs were turned. It's very sobering to think that these measures had to be taken for people in this at-risk category, just as it is a sobering fact that fixtures and fittings in mental health settings today have to be designed in such a way as to remove all ligature points for the same purpose. Who knows what might have happened if this bath cover and neck brace had not been used in Theodora Weston's case. Because, as recorded on page 97 of Presumed Curable, it was discovered that she had developed abrasions on her back and shoulders as a result of struggling against it. And the common sense decision was taken to stop the baths. The Bethlem doctors found no progress to report on Theodora's case, and a year after her admission, the hospital's rules on length of stay, which I outlined 2 weeks ago, came into play. She had to be discharged uncured. A place had to be found for her elsewhere, probably in the kind of long-stay institution that she was sent to Bethlem to avoid. Unusually, a record of where that place was ends up being made in the medical record for Theodora Weston, just as it did for Marie Andre a couple of pages over on page 99 of Presumed Curable. Both Theodora and Marie were transferred to Peckham House within a few weeks of each other in late 1895. Peckham House in South London was a private asylum for the reception of so-called pauper lunatics, as well as for paying patients. Other than the note that she went to Peckham House, there is nothing else in the record about what happened next to Theodora Weston. But as it happens, we do know a little bit more about her story, probably as a result of having featured her photograph on the front cover of Presumed Curable. A few years after publication, a family history researcher got in touch with my co-author Robert Howard from Australia to say that Theodora was the granddaughter of William Pritchard Weston, who was the Premier of the Australian colony of Tasmania in the 1850s and 60s. And she was also the daughter of another Tasmanian politician, Edward Weston, and that she was born in Launceston, a city on the northern coast of Tasmania. The Inquirer had access to a photograph of Theodora in her late teens or early 20s, younger looking than on the cover of Presumed Curable, but clearly the same person. If you go on the internet and search for the phrase Launceston family history alongside the name Theodora Weston, you will find a copy of this photograph along with further details, including her date and her place of death, 1939 in Kew, a suburb of Melbourne in the neighbouring Australian state of Victoria. And this is an intriguing piece of information for me, as I myself was born and brought up in Melbourne. I know on the one hand that Kew was and still is a very well-to-do suburb of the city, and I can easily imagine it being populated by wealthy politicians and their families. But I also know, on the other hand, that Melbourne's mental hospital was located in Kew at this time. So I can't help wondering whether Theodora spent her last years in a family home or in an institution. I guess the answer must lie in the kind of records that are available these days through Find My Past and other family history websites. I'm myself not going to search for it. Maybe I'll leave that task to someone watching this video. So if anyone discovers the answer, please let me know by commenting on this video in Facebook or on YouTube. There's one other thing I want to say in relation to Theodora Weston and by extension about all the people featured in Presumed Curable. If you go and look at that Launceston family history website, you'll see that it says there that Theodora apparently suffered from schizophrenia. Now, I don't know where that information came from or who made that assumption, but I can tell you that it certainly didn't come from her Bethlem records. There was no such diagnosis as schizophrenia in the 19th century, and the diagnostic terms that were in use, such as mania, melancholia, and dementia, do not map across to contemporary mental health conditions in any straightforward manner. Retrospective diagnosis of almost any mental health condition, other than general paralysis of the insane maybe, which was discussed in the book club video we uploaded 2 weeks ago, retrospective diagnosis is notoriously fraught with difficulty. That's one reason why, at the very outset of writing Presumed Curable, my co-author Robert Howard and I decided to avoid it in writing about all the people featured, Theodora Weston included. But there was a second, more important reason for us not wanting to say much about the diagnoses given to patients we were writing about. We simply believed that their diagnoses were the least interesting things about any of these people. Our imaginations were captured instead by the individual stories that emerged out of the records of Bethlem Royal Hospital. The boy who made fireworks, the young woman who believed she was a member of the royal family, the middle-aged man who said his trouble was that he ought to have been a musician, and the respectable married lady who left the house without wearing her bonnet. These stories, and many others, seem to open out to us a world of diverse human experience. And we wanted to avoid closing that world down by headlining the diagnostic classifications that were in use at the time, or at any other time. As if the most significant thing that could be done with all these experiences would be to slot them into a manageable number of diagnostic categories. Well, that's all for now. The next video will be the last in this book club series, and I'd be glad if you had time to read from page 100 right through to the end of Presumed Curable before we upload that next video to our social media channels. In the meantime, if you like, you can keep the conversation going about what you're reading via the museum's Twitter account. Goodbye from Bethlem Museum of the Mind.